is there any one single idea that you feel as if is most valuable or you consider most valuable at this point in time? It can be in relationship to your book, can be general, just a life thing, or just a
Tizita,
single idea. There, that's what I was hoping you'd say. I was
really?
hoping you want to explain that the Tizita framework
Oh
that
my
you sort of
God.
worked on.
So Tizita is a word that is often translated as nostalgia or memory. Um, it is a song, a genre of song. It's also a musical scale. And it is a type of song that is an attempt to capture lost love. Um, and it is both the form of the song and the content of the song are a way to investigate lost love. So when I say the form, I mean like the genre of the song, and the scales that make up the song, um, you know, are an attempt to think through what lost love is. It's very evocative, but I love it because it tries to think about the relationship between form and content and the way in which we lose the memory of the lover and the ways in which we need a container to hold on to the memory of the lover, and that the art of memory is also about the art of songwriting and the art of building form to contain the memory of the lover. So yeah, Tizita was a way for me to think about what I was doing in my book. It was a way to think about the past in a non-dogmatic way. It was to think about the relationship of form to content. So what is the form of writing that I was going to take up in order to think about sort of lost love, the loss of country, the loss of revolutionary possibility. Um, so so yeah, Tizita, I think is such a popular song form as well in Ethiopia. One constantly hears it as they're, on a minibus or if they're just traveling around Addis Ababa. So there's some kind of engagement with lost love that is a popular form of like engaging with culture. And I think, yeah, it's definitely the most important idea for me in terms of the work that I do. Yeah.
Awesome. So Professor, I thought we would start by going through your history and sort of your upbringing. You were born in Ethiopia, if I'm right, and
Mhm.
then you moved to Toronto.
Mhm.
Then you went to Guyana, and then you came to the US. Is that about right?
Oh, then I went to Barbados, and
Oh,
then I went
Barbados.
to Canada, and then
Okay.
the States after that. Yeah, I did all of my. So yeah, I was born in Ethiopia in Gondar. My dad was a doctor there. He actually was the dean of the public health college that's in Gondar. Um, and then we went to Canada during the Derg, and we were there for a number of years. And then my dad joined the World Health Organization. So he was stationed in Guyana and then in Barbados, the Eastern Caribbean. And then from there, I went back to Canada for all of my education. So all of my post-secondary education is actually in Canada. And then
Interesting. How long
after
did
I,
you spend in
sorry?
how long were you in Ethiopia for?
Oh, I left Ethiopia when I was like 2 years old. So I was a
Oh,
baby.
wow.
But
Okay.
I would go there for summers. So, it wasn't like unfamiliar to me growing up. Hmm.
Okay. And so Canada, you did high school and secondary?
I did high school in Guyana and Barbados. I finished my high school in Barbados and then I came to Canada for university. Hmm.
And university you went to?
I went to University of British Columbia for my undergrad. I did a master's at Concordia University in Montreal, and then I did my PhD in social and political thought at York University in Toronto. Hmm.
That's quite the journey. And
Okay.
so Did you travel a lot as a kid, or
Yeah, I mean
was it just
that's a fair amount of traveling right there, from Ethiopia
that?
to Canada to the Caribbean. We would always go back to Ethiopia in the summers or for a lot of the summers. So, even traveling from Guyana to Ethiopia is a trek in itself, right? We often stop in New York and London, or sometimes we actually went through like Moscow, flew through like Cuba and then Moscow, and then sometimes we flew through Athens and Cairo. So yeah, it was quite the adventure. My dad was an internationalist for sure, and he was really intent on us experiencing all angles of the world. So hence all of the travel to all of these different places on our way to Ethiopia.
That's right. Did you have siblings, or do you still have siblings?
I do have siblings. They're all alive and kicking.
Thank
So
God. Thank God.
I have a brother and a sister in Canada, and I have one brother in Ethiopia. He has a construction company in Ethiopia.
So there's a reason to come back then. Good.
What's that?
Good. I said, so there's a reason to come back then.
There to go back to Ethiopia. I go
Give
to
your brother.
Ethiopia often, actually. I mean, I haven't in the past, few years, but I would go every, Christmas and every summer kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, more recently I haven't been going. I've been spending a lot of time in Kenya, actually. Um, just because I've found life in Kenya a bit more peaceful, less hectic. Ethiopia is very hectic these days. So,
Very.
uh Nairobi is more chill, and then I hang out in Lamu a lot as well, so on the northeast coast of Kenya.
Favorite places. Mombasa is also great. Yeah, have you been to any of the national parks in Kenya?
I've been to the main, like the national park that's right in Nairobi.
Okay.
And I've spent some time, gosh, where's that, like the lakes that are like north of Nairobi?
Um, oh God.
The most
Embarrassed.
amount
I've
of
spent
time I've
six.
spent, I used to rent a house on Manda Island, which is across from Lamu.
Yeah,
I had a sabbatical like not last year but the year before, and I spent most of that sabbatical in writing in Lamu, or writing in Manda.
that sounds amazing. Wow. And so, do you have any connection to the other places that you lived in? So you lived in Barbados for some time, in Guyana. Do you have any, is there any emotional connection to those places that you feel?
Yeah, I feel like I'm very much shaped by my time in the Caribbean, actually. I would say my intellectual orientations are very much shaped by a kind of cosmopolitanism that I think exists in the Caribbean that perhaps doesn't exist in the same way in Ethiopia or in East Africa. And I think that is because the Caribbean was always the center of a lot of international trade. Um, it's also the center of the transatlantic slave trade. There's a lot of kind of resistance and discourse around what it means to, you know, overcome the enslavement of Africans in the Caribbean. Um, so yeah, I think there's a certain kind of Pan-Africanism that exists in the Caribbean that's probably stronger than the Pan-Africanism that exists in Ethiopia. Although Ethiopia is an important place for Caribbean people, I would actually say the sentiment and maybe even the lived reality of Pan-Africanism is stronger in the Caribbean than it is in a place like Ethiopia. So I think I've very much been shaped by that in many ways. And so maybe some of my intellectual questions have been, why does that sentiment exist so strongly in the Caribbean and less so in the place that gets called up by Pan-Africanism, which is Ethiopia?
It's a it's a great point, an interesting perspective. I think maybe it's valuable if we take a tangent here, just so some of the audience members can understand what Pan-Africanism means. Do you mind explaining what that means to you?
what does it mean to me? I mean, I think Pan-Africanism is, first of all, a social movement that I would associate with the early 20th century that aimed to connect Black people's experiences from the Caribbean to North America to the continent of Africa. And it's aimed to connect those experiences through creating a kind of political discourse on what it meant to be Black in this world, or what I suppose what the experience of white supremacy has been for Black people across these regions, right? And so that there was a kind of historical experience that was shared by Black people, even if they didn't know each other as such, right? In the Caribbean, in Africa, and in North America. And so Pan-Africanism is an attempt to articulate what that experience is. And it was institutionalized through a series of meetings that began in the early 20th century through people like Du Bois, who we all know as a kind of American thinker, but he was actually very formative in terms of articulating an idea of what Pan-Africanism, is and was. And we should always remember that Du Bois died in Ghana and not in America. So, so people like Du Bois, people like Senghor, who was the first president of Senegal, people like Nkrumah, who was also the first leader of Ghana. And they held a series of Pan-African meetings in London and in Paris and in Manchester, where they tried to articulate this idea of a kind of Black experience or an African experience that was international as well, or transnational, perhaps. Yeah.
Right. And is the Pan-African movement something that still has power behind it in some sense? Is it something that still exists in the mind of younger people, do you think?
So I think that attempt to articulate kind of a Black experience or an African experience still resonates with people across the Caribbean and Africa and North America. I think that the kinds of institutionalization of Pan-Africanism that happened in the early 20th century doesn't exist in the same way. I don't think there's people who are committed to the meetings and the conferences and the discourse. I don't think they exist in the same way. But partly that's because of the victories of Pan-Africanism, right? Like in some ways, Pan-Africanism did win, and we now have independent African countries throughout Africa and in some ways in the Caribbean and so on, right? And we had a civil rights movement in North America. So in some ways, the need for Pan-Africanism has shifted, right? And I would say that maybe part of the problem is that, the lives of Black people are now shaped by the nation state more than they are by a kind of internationalist context. And because the nation state is so strong, people's affiliations are more to their country rather than to this internationalist politics. Although I would prefer people were more committed to Pan-Africanism than they were to the nation state. But that's another story.
In some sense, I agree with you, but I think I would fight for rebranding. So, okay, that's very interesting. You did a PhD, and you studied social and political thought. Were there any thinkers that were specifically influential in your thinking at the time that you found?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I probably associate myself with kind of the critical theory tradition. And when I say critical theory, I mean like people like Adorno, people from the Frankfurt School, so kind of more the German critical theory tradition, and Adorno, Horkheimer, Walter Benjamin, that kind of stuff. I think they've been really important to helping me develop a framework for thinking about both political economy, the psyche, one's emotional state, one's spiritual state, as all sort of connected together. So yeah, those are the people that have been most influential for me. Yeah.
Right. So I'm gonna ask a very dumb and naive question now. What is social and political thought? What do those
I
things
mean,
mean?
I mean, so what social and political thought as a program tries to really examine are the ideas that have shaped the development of politics and social life. It the program started as a very Eurocentric program, so it was interested in the ideas that shaped European political life. I think I was one of the first students to really try and think about that in a non-European context. So I wrote my dissertation on the revolution in the 1974 revolution in Ethiopia, which is an interesting case because it is shaped by a lot of European political thought, actually. So it's very much about Marxist discourse in an African context, right? So my training in critical theory in a place like social and political thought at York University was really important because how else would I be able to engage in a fair and critical manner with the kinds of things that were coming out of Ethiopia in the 1960s and 70s without that training that I got in my PhD program. Mm-hmm.
Right. And so are you saying that a majority of it is a way it's just a framework by which we sort of examine political growth, social change?
I think it's the way we
What is
examine social change. What do you mean? Like, what does social and political thought as a department do? I think it's trying
yeah,
to examine social change. It's trying to think about the ideas that shape social change. I wouldn't use the term political growth because that means that politics is moving in like a linear direction, and I'm not sure anybody in my program would agree with that. But certainly, it's trying to think about the ideas that shape social change, but also how ideas are linked to the ways in which cultural life and social life is organized as well. Mm-hmm.
okay. Makes sense. Makes a lot of sense. And so you did your PhD program. You said you did your dissertation in sort of the student revolution movement in Ethiopia in the 60s and 70s.
Yeah, so I looked
Um,
the 1974 revolution in Ethiopia. I mean, I have a book that's called Ethiopia in Theory, which is a kind of revised version of the dissertation. The dissertation was the first go, which is often the case. And then one publishes the book after they're able to revise it. So yeah, in the dissertation and in the book, I'm really trying to think about the ideas that shaped the 1974 revolution, but also shaped the student movement that kind of shaped the 1974 revolution in Ethiopia. Mm-hmm.
I should say dissertation is incredible, and the book is really good. So what was the student revolution in Ethiopia about? What caused it? And do you mind walking me through for a very naive and
Are you that naive? I'm not sure you're that naive. Um, what caused the 1974 revolution? I think a number of things cause it. So I would say that in many ways, the students of there was a student movement in Ethiopia, a very strong and disciplined student movement in Ethiopia, but also amongst Ethiopian students that were studying abroad in the 1960s and 1970s. And they had a number of journals called, some of them were called Struggle, some of them were called Challenge. Um, there were a number of other names. And they would publish like really hardcore kind of theoretical texts about the history of Ethiopia, but using a Marxist framework. And a lot of it was sort of about agriculture production. A lot of it was about, education and more generally the development needs of the country. And I think amongst those students, there was a sense that Ethiopia was a backward place, that it hadn't entered modernity fully, and that there needed to be a kind of revolutionary social change in the country in order to fully bring Ethiopia into modernity. And I think at some point, Ethiopia probably tried to align itself with, with the UK and then later with the US. But these students really felt that a much more radical program was needed in order to transform the country and bring it into modernity. And so a lot of the demands of the students, again, were around education, but also poverty alleviation. They were very concerned about what it means to, no longer have poverty in Ethiopia. And that meant attending to questions of land reform, thinking about how land was distributed, thinking about how wealth was distributed in the country, thinking about kind of the social arrangements that people were engaged in terms of feudalism, because Ethiopia was still had a very traditional kind of social organization that was rooted in sort of the Orthodox Church in Ethiopia as well. So it was all about dismantling that kind of social system and transforming it. So yeah, but that was one aspect of the revolution. There was also clearly a kind of economic crisis that was happening in the country in like the early 1970s. There was also the question of unequal wealth distribution, which meant that the cities, absorbed a lot of the wealth that was produced by the country. There was a famine in the north, in Wallo, which meant that there was a lot of peasant unrest as well. And I think all of those factors contributed to the 1974 revolution. And I think land reform was probably the kind of thing that tied all of these kind of social groups together. Yeah, and just a weak monarchy and a weak state, right? So basically you have a kind of coalescing of interests and a coalescing of groups that meant that the state that existed in 1974 in Ethiopia was dissolved, and then there was a kind of protracted process through which different groups trying to vie for power, right? And eventually, what ends up happening is that the military takes over, and they adopt the language of the student movement. They adopt a lot of the Marxist language of the student movement, although not necessarily committed to the types of grassroots, bottom-up, democratic politics that was advocated by the student movement at the time.
Right. So it's sort of an alignment of a bunch of things, both economics and social. Mm-hmm. And is there a reason why you picked that specific time period? Is there something about that time period that felt as if it was a transition or something very important?
I think it's the most important thing that's happened to Ethiopia in the past, 150 years, for sure. You have the kind of the dismantling of an entire social system. You have the dismantling of the monarchy. You have a kind of re-articulation of the meaning of the nation state along very, very different values than what existed prior to the revolution, right? Ethiopia was and still is in some ways a very socially hierarchical society, and there was a real sense of trying to transform that. Did the revolution succeed? I'm not sure it did, but there was certainly a big vision of what was possible at the time. And I think people were really committed and really disciplined. And I would say that, why was I interested? Because I guess I grew up with people who were involved in many of those social movements, cousins, my father to some degree. So the language of the Ethiopian Revolution is something that permeated the household. And I had questions about what actually happened. I think I had questions from the beginning of my childhood about what actually happened. And part of the reason why we left Ethiopia was the fallout from the revolution. But we weren't necessarily anti-revolution. We were more just like the revolution went wrong. So I wanted to understand what that meant. So writing the dissertation in many ways, it was about trying to understand my own childhood, I suppose.
This sort of a journey of reflecting on some of these things that you that were part of your life at some point and you
Yeah,
found valuable.
at some point I even call the book a memoir, but it's not a memoir in terms of like this happened and that happened. It's a memoir in terms of trying to understand again the ideas, the social and political forces that shaped so much of why we had to leave Ethiopia, why we were exiled, what it meant to go back to Ethiopia, and that kind of thing. Mm-hmm.
And so, in what ways do you feel as if um, the structure of the country changed after that social movement? And are there ways in which you feel it progressed positively and ways in which you feel it regressed?
I mean, I do think the land reform process was important. And I think that meant that you had an entire class of people who lived off of the rents that they collected from peasants. They were basically destroyed through the revolution. So that's pretty dramatic. Um, I think that was probably a good thing. It probably allowed for a certain kind of freedom to exist amongst ordinary people that didn't exist before. And I think people's sense of their entitlement to I don't think there was a sense of citizenship in Ethiopia prior to the revolution. I think you had a sense that you maybe had obligations that were owed to you or that you owed to some kind of person in a social hierarchy. Um, but the sense that you could demand things from the state or that the state owed you things, and you had rights, right? And that you were an equal to other people that lived in the country, I think is something that happened because of the revolution. So I think those are good things. And I think those are legacies that probably continue to exist in very complicated ways in Ethiopia today. But yeah, those are legacies. I mean, the student movement, I argue in my book, shaped the nature of politics in Ethiopia right until 2016, or right until Abiy Ahmed's kind of election in 2018. So I do think the student movement was probably the most important kind of it was the most important movement in terms of articulating a set of ideas about the path that Ethiopia should go on. Mm-hmm.
Interesting. Interesting. And I've always one of the things that I hear quite a bit is that after the student movement, education somewhat got much worse in the country. And prior to that, it was
How
really
could it
good.
get worse? I mean, their education existed for like 0.001% of the population prior to the revolution. So
Yeah.
sure, it was an elite education that 10 people in Addis could access. And maybe for those 10 people, the standard went down. That might be true. But if Ethiopia is a country where people are citizens and citizens, deserve an education, then what is more important, to have mass education where maybe the standards are a little bit lower, or is it to create an elite that has access to superb education, but nobody else has access to that kind of thing? So I think I would prefer to have mass education for a larger quantity of people, even if the standard is, not as strong as that kind of elite education that existed in Addis. That somebody like my father, who accidentally had access to that education, sure, he got an excellent education, but again, that was like, I mean, that kind of generation of educated Ethiopians all know each other because it was such a small group of people, right? So it's like, what is that? That's not nation building. That's not providing services to a citizenry, right? That's just building an exclusive type of elite, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So that seems almost about exactly right. Just reminded me of my dad. And so are there any ways in which you feel like that movement helped shape the growth of political thought in new and novel ways that you see reflected today? And you mentioned that it impacted the country up until 2016, where we sort of had a change. And do you want to describe what you feel like that change is? And
Yeah, I mean, I think that one, in Ethiopia, land is not private, so nobody
yeah,
owns land as such. People have usufruct rights to the land. So if you've been living on the land and working the land, then you have the right to that land. You have the right to use that land, and your children have the right to use that land. So people who want to commercialize land have to do that through, certain kinds of, application processes to, different levels of the government, different, at the district level, at the Warada level, so on. So there's still some kind of accountability in terms of how land can be used. Although, of course, part of the protest of 2014, was about the fact that land was in some ways being privatized, not necessarily through land being bought and sold straightforwardly, but through leasehold. So people were able to lease land, and then they would sell their leases. So, and there was a lot of protests around that attempt to privatize land in a kind of undercover way. I think the question of, what is Ethiopia as a nation? Is it a collection of nations, nationalities, and peoples, or is it, one set of people? That those debates come straight out of the student movement, right? They debated those things in a very, hot way. And the idea that different language groups could have autonomy within a federation is something that comes out of the student movement as well. It's a highly contested politics in Ethiopia, of which people are willing to go to create civil war over, apparently. So there's definitely a lot of opposition to that language, although certainly in 1991, when EPRDF came into power, there was a sense that the nation was coming together as a collection of nations, nationalities, and peoples, and not as a kind of homogenous group that all spoke Amharic and that were all Orthodox Christian and so on. So there was some kind of attempt to recognize the diversity of the country, but also to recognize the historical processes through which these groups had come together. So what did it mean for different groups to belong to the Ethiopian state? And on what terms were they incorporated into the Ethiopian state? And some groups were incorporated in unequal ways, and other groups were dominant. So the Constitution of 1991 is some attempt to address those inequalities. And again, the question of inequality and how groups were incorporated into the nation state is a debate that comes out of the student movement. So certainly the whole question of nations and nationalities in Ethiopia is something people are fighting about to this day. And there is a social movement in Ethiopia that believes that the language of nations, nationalities, and peoples, and the language of this type of affirmative action in some ways is divisive, right? To call people out and say that, I am different from you because I was incorporated into the state under different circumstances. People find that to be a divisive mechanism. I find that incredible myself, but because it seems about erasing people's histories rather than dealing with history. But certainly, within Ethiopia today, some people really hate that language and would like the Constitution to go away, and would like the entire kind of legacy of the student movement to disappear as well. That is part of the contentious politics of Ethiopia at this moment.
So so it's your belief that we haven't made much progress on the ethno-national front?
I mean, when people say ethno-national, it's always like this in this derogatory fashion. So
Sure.
certainly there was some kind of attempt in the student movement to think about what the Ethiopian nation was, how people were incorporated into the nation state. I think there was progress. I think 1991 for me, in some ways, is progress. Like that constitution is progress. But what happened was that there was not enough consensus amongst various constituencies around that constitution. And so you've had people fighting that constitution ever since it was brought into being, and fighting it in the name of a pan-Ethiopian identity, and a pan-Ethiopian political project, right? So I'm not going to comment on, you know, I mean, I will say that I think that that attempt to build a pan-Ethiopian project that refuses to acknowledge historical inequality is, to me, inherently problematic.
Makes sense. Makes sense. Okay. One of the things that I find very interesting and a bit unusual is that you have this sort of grouping of people that are roughly, younger Ethiopians in college, let's say, and you have a category of people who deeply identify with their ethnicity, and then you have a category of people, which I would include myself in, that just consider themselves Ethiopian in some sense and don't even know enough to identify with any one ethnicity, but then get pushed to one side or the other as a result of other people's interests, I guess, in some sense. And so do you feel as if there's this need, one question that I have outside of that, you can choose to answer that too, but is, in what way do you get younger people interested enough in the ideas that the country hopes to share with the world, and unified enough where ethnicity is not as much a question anymore, and it's more nationalistic in some sense? Is there anywhere else that's been applied that you know of, or any?
I mean, Switzerland is organized through language groups as well, right? So it's not as if Ethiopia is.
I mean, we have 80.
Huh?
We have like 80 something. We have like 80 something language
Yeah, but
groups,
it's not
right?
right. So what the Constitution says is that every nation, nationalities, and peoples have the right to self-determination, but not every single language group is organized into its own political unit, right? So we have like the Southern peoples, whatever political region there. But the major language groups have their own political like they have their own regional entity, or what we might call a province or something, right? So the Amhara, the Oromo, Tigray, and so on, right? Yeah. What was the question though? I mean, how do you get people to more? I mean, I think the problem in Ethiopia is that you have a kind of the way that the student movement is understood today in Ethiopia is as something bad that happened, right? These modernist Ethiopians that got their ideas from Europe and America, and then they brought them back to Africa, and they nearly colonized us with their American and European Marxist ideas and so on. But there's no actual engagement with the ideas, right? And one of the things that I try to argue is that the students actually appropriated social science and Marxist concepts from their education in the West, and use them to creatively think about what was the historical conditions that existed in Ethiopia, and to come up with answers in a creative fashion. And I think that the way that the student movement is understood today is as if it was like this kind of dogmatic, movement that didn't have debate, that didn't think through stuff. It was just like homogenous and just like imposed like one set of ideas on the country, when in fact there were multiple different types of ideas, and there was a debate, and there is a history through which the question of nationalities was addressed. And so my book is some kind of attempt to take that history of ideas seriously. And I think that, part of the problem in Ethiopia is that that history needs to be taken more seriously, not just dismissed as like some kind of colonial entity. Why was the question of nationalities and, diversity so important to the student movement? How did they answer it? What is it? Why were they so concerned about the nature of the Ethiopian state? How did they understand the inheritance of the 19th century in terms of how it shaped 20th century Ethiopian nation state politics, and the relationship to various groups in the country? I don't think those are flimsy questions. And we actually do have an intellectual tradition that's attempted to answer these questions seriously. But instead of thinking about that intellectual tradition in a serious way, we shout at each other through a set of slogans and so on, and stereotypes and cliches. So my book is some kind of attempt to take more seriously the types of questions that the student movement was asking, and to show that it's still relevant today. And it would do people, if people are really concerned about Ethiopia, rather than just simply asserting an Ethiopian identity as if that means anything, they should take that history of ideas seriously, but they should take the complexity of the country more seriously as well. Yeah.
Very fair. Very fair. And so where do you think the country is right now? I know this is pretty general, but in some sense, do you feel like, in many ways, obviously, economically, we're better off than we were then, but are there ways in which you feel, are there ways in which you feel as if we're worse off than we were then?
Then being when?
In the student movement.
Right. Are we worse off? I don't know if we're worse
Anyway,
off. I think there's a lot of chaos in the country right now. I think there's a lot of political chaos. I think there's a sense of really differing and competing ideas about what the nation state should look like and how to bring people together. And I think there's people are not really willing to listen to each other in terms of what is the way forward. I think that there's a lot of militia life, hashtag militia life, in Ethiopia. And I think that a lot of the economy is probably run through militias. And that has something to do with, like the level of conflict in the country today, which is pretty high. So I think that maybe economically we have been better off. Perhaps when Ethiopia had a developmental state, which was basically from like the late 90s until 2018. I'm not sure where we are in terms of development indicators today. I think there's a lot of loss of life because of conflict. I think people are not going to school in a lot of the regions in the countryside. I think access to healthcare has been diminished also because of conflict. So I think a lot of the development indicators that would show progress have actually slowed down in the past few years, which I think is quite sad. And I think that the question of how to address poverty, which is ultimately, the question that the student movement was trying to ask, has been pushed off the table in many ways. And there's this question of, nationalities and so on, but we're not bringing the nationalities question back to the question of poverty anymore, right? If the nationalities question, by which I mean how do certain groups get representation within the state, if that was an important question, it was important because it was about getting resources for groups in order to address questions of poverty. And I think that question of poverty is off the table, and now it's just about representation for the sake of representation. Am I making sense to you, young man?
Yes, ma'am. you, you are. I think that makes sense. if we can go into some of the what framework you used. I know you're writing a book right now. I don't know if it's out yet. No, not yet. Okay. Do you mind getting into a little bit of what that's about
Oh my goodness. I mean,
and
so
the
yeah,
thinking you have?
sorry.
You mind telling us a little bit about what that's about and the
Yeah, that's
thinking behind
definitely
that?
a book in formation. So the book is called A Jewel in the Ear. Um,
Love the name.
the 2020-2022 Civil War in Ethiopia and Africanist political thought. Um, the book has taken various iterations. I'm really trying to think about what the 2020 to 2022 Civil War between the regional government of Tigray and the federal government of Ethiopia. What was that civil war all about? What was the meaning of it? Um, and I'm, on the one hand, I've written this book about the revolution, the student movement. So the war, in some ways, is one way to see the consequences of the student movement and the revolution and so on. Certainly EPRDF and TPLF were one iteration of what the student movement was all about, right? So, and certainly in 2018, you have a new prime minister coming into power who quite explicitly says, I'm done with the student movement. I'm not interested in the politics or ideas of the student movement. It is a new day for Ethiopia. Kaka on all of that nonsense that those student movement people talked about. So, on the one hand, I think it makes sense for me to write about the Civil War because it's like really shows the end of the era of the student movement in some ways, right? And what's interesting is that rather than the country flourishing and embracing kind of new riches or new ideas, the country has devolved into a civil war. And even though the civil war between Tigray and the federal government has ended, there continues to be a lot of conflict, unprecedented levels of conflict in the country. So, despite the attempt to kind of dismiss the questions that were brought up by the student movement, in many ways, they persist, right? In terms of the ways in which these conflicts are organized. And it seems to me that one of the things that we're going to have to do if we're going to address these conflicts in Ethiopia is actually go back to the questions of the student movement and think about what the nation state actually is in Ethiopia and think about historical injustices and how groups were incorporated into the nation state, etc. So there's that. The book is an attempt to think through all of that, but it's also to what surprised me the most about going through the war in some ways was the ways in which people were unable to engage in the war in any kind of sensible manner. There was a lot of shrill engagement. There was a lot of shouting, and I don't even mean by Ethiopians. I also mean by academics who are not Ethiopians, who are in African studies or who are members of various Black diaspora groups and so on. There was not any there was very few spaces in which people were really systematically trying to think about why this war existed and how it could be resolved. And people took sides very easily. But also the war was characterized by, a lot of violence, a lot of mass atrocities, a lot of, the use of starvation as a weapon of war, a lot of gender-based violence. And the ways in which people were willing to not talk about those things as they were taking a position, for or against was quite shocking to me. And I wondered about that. And so part of what the book is trying to think through is why were people unable to think about these mass atrocities, the mass violence and that kind of thing. So yeah, that's part of what I'm trying to work through.
Right. Seems like something we desperately need. How do you manage, when you write about things like this, where you have this conflict that just happened, it more or less ended about a year ago, and people are still very sensitive to the situation. And, partly you're also Ethiopian, so I'm sure you have your biases.
Biases. I'm an Amhara that's supposed to take a very particular kind of position. And I get trolled all the time on social media because they're like, what kind of Amhara are you anyways? Da 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 da. So
I'm sure. So how do you manage the intellectual pursuit of trying to be objective and write about something, but also share the message and sort of write the story that happened?
yeah, I mean that's an interesting. I don't know if I don't really like buy into things like objective as such and biases as such. I think what is important is a certain amount of reflexivity. So a capacity to think about the conditions of possibility for your own thought, right? And to constantly interrogate those conditions of possibility. And that's what I mean by critical theory. So it's not necessarily about I'm being more objective, but I'm really relentlessly trying to subject my own modes of thinking to critique and to really thinking about how it is that I arrive at a position, right? I think that is the more honest way to go. And I think that means I read everything possible that has to do with this war. I relentlessly try to think about African politics, and I engage African politics at a number of different levels in terms of reading and talking to people and so on. I have a strong research ethic, I suppose. And again, I would say that part of the problem with a lot of the research on Ethiopia is that it's quite thin. It's not thinking historically, nor is it trying to really develop the right, not the right, but nor is it trying to develop specific concepts, social historical concepts that really grab the reality of life in Ethiopia. And to think about the reality of life in Ethiopia is not just to think about Ethiopia in isolation as this like unique country, but to really think about all the different types of processes, social, political, economic processes that shape reality in Ethiopia. So yeah, I mean, I think that's what I do. It's like I subject myself to relentless critique and have a strong research ethic. I would call myself very reflexive in my approach rather than just objective as such. Yeah.
So no biases, essentially.
I think biases assumes that you can correct something and that there is some kind of pure position that is right. And I don't think there is a pure position that Elleni Centime Zeleke, can arrive at, right? That's not the thing. It's like I'm involved in a dialogue. I'm involved in a conversation. I think about the conditions of possibility for my own thought. I try to be relentless in that, but also, and I make propositions. My books are propositions and they're ways to think. They're not ultimate answers. And I'm not trying to come up with an ultimate answer either. In some ways, my books are a series of questions, right? But there are good questions and there are bad questions, I think, right? And a good question is one that really comes out of a thick orientation to the situation. A bad question is one that can come up, you can have a easy yes or no answer to, or that like takes the situation to be simple, right? So I think, yeah, that's the thing. Like the question of objectivity and biases assumes that there's some kind of pure position that one can take. And that's dangerous in a way, right? To assume that there's some kind of purity that I can have as opposed to another person. I don't ever want to assume that about myself, right?
Valid. That's absolutely valid. And so in some sense, you're saying you try to be as rigorous as possible about the complexity that already exists, and attempt as much as possible not to change that or at all. Um, are there ways in which you feel like the conflict that happened in Ethiopia, are there parts of the conflict that you feel as if people don't understand as well as they should, that have been sort of not given as much attention as they should have been during the conflict, that you sort of, in going back and learning about them, were like, wow, this is something that was crucial, extremely important, and I didn't see much attention given to it?
I mean, I do think like the political economy of Ethiopia is like really misunderstood. I remember like seeing these accusations against the EPRDF that like, $33 billion was taken out of the country. It's like Ethiopia doesn't have that kind of money. Like Ethiopia is a very poor country, right? There isn't like you can say like in the Congo, for instance, there's all these minerals, right? And like people can sell gold or they can sell other minerals that does actually earn a lot of money in the foreign exchange, right? Ethiopia is an agriculture based society, right? 80% of people still work in smallholder farming, or maybe it's 75% or something right now. That means that people are feeding themselves, they're working the land, they're not actually producing a lot of surplus, they're not making a ton of money. And it also means that the elites in Addis are not the kinds of elites that you would find in a place like Angola or even in a place like Congo. They're not flush with foreign exchange. And I think that there is a lot of frustration with poverty, but the roots of poverty in Ethiopia, I think, are quite different than they are for a number of African countries, where it can be said that there is a wealthy elite that is making a lot of money, that is kind of a comprador class that sits somewhere between the world of the West and is selling. Their role is simply to sell the commodities that the country produces. Ethiopia doesn't have a lot of exports, right? So I think there's a complete misunderstanding of the political economy of Ethiopia. That's one thing that I think people don't understand. What else don't people understand? I think I'll just leave it there. There's probably
Okay, that's
many other things. Yeah.
that's completely fair. Are there things about war, perhaps maybe this could nudge you in a certain direction, but are there things about war, and the economics of war and the profitability of war at times, that you feel as if might have played a role in this conflict? Or do you think this was just a conflict in the sense that, sets of people disagreed?
I do think it was a war where sets of people disagreed, actually. I don't think
And that's it.
I don't think there's a big conspiracy behind it. I mean,
You don't think there's
no,
any profit seeking incentive? No.
no,
Oh, wow,
no,
that's remarkable.
no. I don't
Um,
like who's making a profit here? Who would it be?
um,
I don't think any.
well,
I
well,
think that's a big, like, that's part of the kind of misunderstanding of the political economy of Ethiopia. They're like, who would be making a profit? Like, the TPLF isn't making a profit. Like, Abiy Ahmed isn't making a profit. Like, Prosperity
one
Party is, huh?
someone's selling ammunition. So
Somebody is selling ammunition. That is true. And somebody is funneling ammunition into the country. And I think that what you have in Ethiopia is the transformation of a developmental state into a militia state. And I think that people are now organized, like I think the economy in some ways is now organized through militias, right? People transporting goods and so on through various militias. And that is because you have a state that's weakened, remarkably weakened in very little time, from being quite strong in like 2017, 2018 to being very weak. And I think that's part of the consequences of the war. I think there are probably a lot of interests that would rather have this kind of militia-like economy continue running rather than have a developmental state come back into existence in Ethiopia. But that's a different question than simply saying that there is some kind of like secret group that's like profiting off the war. I think that the war,
No,
right? I think the war transformed the ways in which people make money, and of course,
yeah.
There's going to be new interests that would like to keep that kind of system of making money alive today, right? So I would agree with that. Right.
So okay, so you're less inclined to believe that there's this profit incentive that might have tangentially caused it to happen.
No.
Understandable reason. Okay.
I think that there was genuinely a set of conflicting ideas about the path the country should take between prosperity and TPLF. Mm-hmm.
And do you mind explaining what, in just the simplest terms you possibly could, what that just the fundamental disagreement was?
I mean, I think that TPLF, EPRDF ran a developmental state. I don't think Prosperity Party is interested in that at all, right? They're interested in a kind of free market, economy. They're interested in privatizing land. They're interested in individual. I mean, if you have nations, nationalities, and peoples in Ethiopia, they're guaranteed, the right to land. Like land is vested in the nations, nationalities, and peoples of Ethiopia. That's going to go against any kind of private property endeavors, right? Like there's a contradiction right there. So I think that there is a lot of people who wanted to open up the Ethiopian economy in 2018, 2019, that, kind of probably went against some of the things that EPRDF, TPLF said that they believed in. Although EPRDF itself, started to implement kind of neoliberal policies itself, but certainly not to the extent that Prosperity Party was pushing for, right? So I don't think you can have the kind of economy that is, where land is fully privatized and still have a constitution where you say land is vested in the nations, nationalities, and peoples of Ethiopia. Like those things are diametrically opposed to each other. So
yeah. I agree. I just don't understand how you resolve that type of conflict. Do you feel as if and maybe this might be more of an opinion-based question rather than something you can objectively speak to, but do you feel as if that transition to a free market system is necessary or is just bound to happen at some point?
Bound to happen or is necessary? No, I don't think either. I think the path that Ethiopia was on was some attempt to mitigate the effects of market relations through a state that had social policies that meant that groups of people were not affected arbitrarily or completely arbitrarily by the way the market operated. I don't think it was an anti-capitalist state by any means, but it certainly was a state that tried to mitigate the effects of the market on social relations. I don't think that's something that Prosperity Party was interested in. How do you resolve that? I mean, can you resolve those differences? I mean, you need elites to agree that that is a political project worth pursuing. And it seems to me that in Ethiopia, you had the total collapse of some kind of elite consensus around that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, one of the things that I find very interesting is the perception of a war rather than what's happening on the ground itself.
Mm-hmm.
What are the ways in which you feel, if at all, the media affected the translation of facts from the ground to people's perception?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I was saying that what surprised me the most about the war was that the the ways in which the war just affected people's lives in terms of gender-based violence, in terms of access to food, in terms of access to roads, that kinds of things. I mean, there was so much supposed like contestation of those facts, right? And supposedly all the starvation or near starvation was like fake news and it was made up and so on, right? So it was hard to know what reality was at a certain point, right? And I think that's partly what I'm trying to write about in the book, actually, is the kind of machinery that generated the denial of all of this type of situation, right? Which it all played out on like social media and in like various news articles and so on, right? So yeah.
Right. I mean, I don't in any way think that that's something that just affects Ethiopia. I think it's something that we've seen in the
Yeah.
US, especially in 16, um,
Well, it's
but
hard
is
to know what
happening more.
reality is throughout the world, right? There's like somebody says this happened, and they're like, "No, that's fake news. This act is the real story," and you're just like, "What?" Right?
Yeah.
So what?
Yeah.
Every single person has to become a hardcore media analyst to like get at truth these days.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
It's
I think part of the arena of war today is the information war, right? So wars don't just happen in terms of, what's going on the field, but they actually happen in terms of information as well, for sure.
right. And I'm not sure how many of us take that to be a very real thing. The idea that there are actually people who get up on stage and say things that are completely false for that sake.
For the sake of
It's hard
effect.
it's hard to internalize, especially for people my age. The idea that there would be somebody up on stage speaking, and to a group of hundreds of people and just blatantly lying is a difficult thing to accept. But I agree. Sort of finishing up, what are some of the ways in which because I love and I enjoy thinking about the future, and I try not to spend as much time in the present, although I agree that history is extremely important. But what are some of the ways in which you feel like, if you have any ideas at all, um, systems in Ethiopia, perhaps governance systems or social systems, can change to better aid the country, make it better, so we don't end up in this cyclical
Right.
war?
Well,
Or do you have any
I think that the future is always shaped by the past and different ways in which we
ideas?
interpret the past. It's always shaped by the air that we breathe. But I mean, I don't know, you're the young person. Like you tell me what can happen. I mean, I would say that there's a lot of, interesting projects that, one of the things I want to do is like just do like basic education, like math, literature, like reading, writing, um, arithmetic. But then like, is it possible to teach reading, writing, and arithmetic? And also like teach like democratic concepts through them. And I think that's like something that I'm interested in pursuing in Ethiopia, like a kind of educational program that is very basic, but also um, instills new ideas around like democratic practice as well. So that education isn't just something that you get from above, that's like, injected into your brain from above, but it actually is really about critical thinking from the get-go. I don't know. But I think like little projects like that are really important. Like that, I have the idea to do that at like some kind of like, set up a school like that. But that maybe could be scaled up at another point. But maybe you should come up with stuff
Well, I've heard they're waiting for you, and so
for
you
me.
you should head back.
Huh.
One of the things I find difficult to understand, but also can reason with in some sense, is why it is that a lot of intellectuals that live outside of Ethiopia don't want to go back to Ethiopia. And I understand that there's the economic issue of just not getting enough um, for the time you've spent garnering that intellectual knowledge. But I think that's sort of one of the key things is just getting a lot of smart people to go back.
Don't trust the smart people so much.
I don't
I have
trust intellectuals.
less faith in the smart people than you.
I um I agree. I agree. There's a lot of, especially during
There's a lot
COVID,
of
there was
really smart people in Ethiopia right now. We
I
don't
agree.
necessarily need all those smart people with their foreign degrees and education. They might
It'd be nice
actually be a problem, huh?
they might actually be a problem. I do agree. In some cases, they're more of a problem than they are a benefit. But sort of wrapping up, and this has been extremely informative for me, and I've learned a tremendous amount. Um, is there any one single idea that you feel as if is most valuable or you consider most valuable at this point in time? It can be in relationship to your book, it can be general, just a life thing, or just a
Tizita,
single idea. There, that's what I was hoping you'd say. I was
really?
hoping you want to explain that the Tizita framework
Oh
that
my
you sort of
God.
worked on.
So Tizita is a word that is often translated as nostalgia or memory. Um, it is a song, a genre of song. It's also a musical scale. And it is a type of song that is an attempt to capture lost love. And it is both the form of the song and the content of the song are a way to investigate lost love. So when I say the form, I mean like the genre of the song, and the scales that make up the song, you know, are an attempt to think through what lost love is. It's very evocative, but I love it because it tries to think about the relationship between form and content and the way in which we lose the memory of the lover and the ways in which we need a container to hold on to the memory of the lover, and that the art of memory is also about the art of songwriting and the art of building form to contain the memory of the lover. So yeah, Tizita was a way for me to think about what I was doing in my book. It was a way to think about the past in a non-dogmatic way. It was to think about the relationship of form to content. So what is the form of writing that I was going to take up in order to think about sort of lost love, the loss of country, the loss of revolutionary possibility. So so yeah, Tizita, I think is such a popular song form as well in Ethiopia. One constantly hears it as they're, on a minibus or if they're just traveling around Addis Ababa. So there's some kind of engagement with lost love that is a popular form of like engaging with culture. And I think, yeah, it's definitely the most important idea for me in terms of the work that I do. Yeah.
Well, I have to say it's a beautiful idea. And I just love the word Tizita. It rings so deep for me.
Right.
I think it's wonderful. Professor Elleni Centime, this has been amazing. Thank you so much for gracing me with your time. I'm honored that you'd spend this time with me, and I can't wait to see what's to come for you. And I can't wait to read your upcoming book. And thanks again.
Okay, well, thank you for having me. It was really fun.
So much fun for
I
me
hope
too.
to meet you in Addis Ababa. Doing
Yes,
great.
ma'am.
All right, good.
Okay,
All right, take care.